good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in this world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for the event, and I welcome you. We have a really interesting webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access it on demand. We'll be sending out a link after the event that will take you right to the webinar. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for any of our panelists at any time during the event, don't wait, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take probably about 15 minutes or so near the end of the webinar and go through those audience questions. Okay, we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and dive right on into today's webinar, which is Securing the Code, DevOps, Security, and AppSec. Okay, our panelists today are Colin Dominy, who's Senior Principal Transformation Consultant at CA VeryCode, Jeannie Warner, who's Security Manager at Whitehat Security, and Ozzie Cohen, who is Co-Founder and General Manager North America at WhiteSource. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent, excellent. Colin, are you with me?
I am certainly. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, and Ozzie, you're with me as well. All right, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and dive right on in here. But before we do, just want to alert the folks playing at home that today's discussion is actually based in part on Security Boulevard's latest ebook, which is Securing the Code, DevOps, Security, and AppSec, and that's now available via download on securityboulevard.com. And attendees of today's webinar and registrants of today's webinar will receive a copy via download link right after the webinar. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start the discussion. Before we do, though, I am actually remiss in asking our presenters to just tell us a little bit about themselves and their company. So Colin, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your company there.
Thanks, Charlene. So my name's Colin Dominy. I'm a transformation consultant with CA VeryCode. Personally, I come from a background of embedded systems development. I did lots of crypto, lots of security. I got into application security by means of running the AppSec program at a big investment bank. I've been doing this for a while. I've been doing this at scale. Joined VeryCode, helping some of VeryCode's largest customers integrate VeryCode tooling into their environments, and actually to be able to scale application security. And lately, with the transformation that we're seeing towards securing DevOps, I'm really at the forefront of helping customers transform their business by being able to embed security right into their DevOps process. Thank you.
All right, great, thanks. Jeannie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Absolutely. I've actually been on the security side of the force, and I started Network back in 2001. So I was 10 years with IBM Security in different ways, a couple years over at the Microsoft Security Research Center, then worked my way back through hardware. I spent a lot of time running SOCs and running security operations. And so when I came over here to the application security side of the space, it was very much to say, yes, we are all about the code. It's very important because these are the things that your standard security teams can't see. And getting DevOps and getting the programmers to code more securely kind of makes everybody's job easier further on down the line.
All right, great. Thanks, Jeannie. Ozzie, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you very much. So my name is Ozzie Cohen. I'm a co-founder of WhiteSource and the general manager for North America. I've been doing CEO roles in startup companies, Israeli startup companies, for more than 20 years. But what really brought me to this table and to this story of open source management was actually an acquisition. One of my previous company was acquired by CA Technologies, and the whole process of reviewing the code, making sure that we provide them the updated inventory and answer all the questions. Well, that was almost 10 years ago, right? Was quite a tedious process in using scanners, etc. Well, we didn't like this approach, so that's when the whole idea of, why not looking for a different way to do things, an approach that will be embedded with the development cycle was brought to our mind. We have 3 partners, and from that experience, we decided to start a company. We started White Source at 2011, and since then we are growing very fast, 300% a year, catering a lot of companies, right now that are using open source as a, as mainstream part in their application development.
All right, great. Great. So we'll go ahead and thank you all 3 for telling us a little bit about yourself. So we'll go ahead and dive right into the topic. As I said, it's security and application development, kind of that whole DevSecOps idea. And the reason why we're talking about this is because there has been a push over the last year or so to really kind of shift security much farther left in the DevOps or the application development cycle, and really kind of focusing more these days on, rather than trying to secure completed applications or applications that have been released kind of at the user level. Now we're looking at ways to make sure that the application is secure before it ever reaches the end users. So that's kind of the general idea that we're hoping to impart in today's webinar. But that and obviously so much more. But I guess one of the basic questions that I'd like to kind of start this webinar with is, why now? Why is it so important now to have security as part of the DevOps process? And Jeannie, since you have both kind of the hardware and the software perspective, maybe you can kind of start the discussion there on really why it is so important to have security as part of that DevOps process.
Absolutely. Well, I think all of our companies gave a little cheer at Verizon's data breach investigation report again this year, because as you know, there's 2 types of things that have to do with security. There's just incidents, what makes a network unavailable, and then there's actual data breaches. And data breaches and data privacy has been a really big deal, and it's getting bigger, and end users are actually now getting angry and upset at companies that are unable to secure. And the biggest input into all of those is going in through the web applications, some mobile applications possibly, but web applications really is the biggest avenue that people are walking right in to a poorly coded website. They're stealing data, they're getting access at the back end, and they're profiting. And so it really has been kind of a beautiful couple of years in a very dark way for companies such as all 3 of us represent, because finally people are saying, hey, maybe it's not the end user. Maybe we need to be developing safer and more secure code. And so a lot of companies are now saying, oh, I get it. How do I start? Where do I start? And so Security Boulevard and pushing on the DevOps has been awesome, because we start saying right back there when a coder first sits down and says, what are we going to make? How are they designing it better? Are they have the right, what can we do to make the process better and more secure, so that by the time things get into production, they're already more secure than they were before they started looking into it.
So with that in mind, then, do you think that when we're talking about it being more secure and they're thinking harder about it, how does that impact the code that they're using or the code that they're building? I mean, what are some of the ways that they're being more mindful?
Well, let's look, if we want to look at a couple really high-profile things that went by. I'm sure everybody listening remembers the T-Mobile attack, where one person just simply discovered while logging into their T-Mobile website that their actual phone number was used as part of the URL defining where they were going to. So that brilliant guy went up and said, well, what if I put in the phone number of my best buddy or brother that has another T-Mobile? And he entered that number and discovered suddenly, without doing any authentication or checking the authorization, he was now in his brother's account because he'd authenticated as one, and he was somehow authorized to go be somebody else just by changing the number in the URL. That's sloppy coding. And that is rife throughout the industry and throughout websites. And that's the first of the easy, low-hanging fruit that we've got to solve in DevSecOps. That can't happen anymore.
It's Ozzy. Yeah. I think obviously security in general, or the requirements from corporates to secure themselves is growing all the time, right? The risk is there, etc. But there's several trends that are happening here. Firstly, is that everyone will agree right now that too much money is already invested in the network security side, right? To the fact that, every dollar that you put right now in more network application security side of the house is basically, I don't want to say redundant, but, it's less effective. The new frontier is on the application side. It's easier today to penetrate to the application, sometimes because of a sloppy code, sometimes because of lack of practices of development, sometimes because, hackers can can attack an application in a much easier way than attacking the network, which is already, as I said, over-secured. So there is a shift towards that direction. The point is that, what we find is that in many cases, when there is an exploit, when there is an opportunity to attack, attackers jump on that very quickly. So once a vulnerability is found, and if, in case of open source, it's always being published as well, attackers immediately seek a way to to respond, to hit the different websites or applications that are suffer or can be exploited through that vulnerability. So the time to fix becoming shorter and shorter. And if you'll add to that the fact that, corporates have today many more applications, more vulnerabilities are being found, then they need to automate the entire process, from discovery of a vulnerability, whether it's in the proprietary code or the open source code, identify the risk of it and then fix it. The time is getting shorter and the number of vulnerability that has to be fixed is growing. So only automation can deal with that. And when we deal with the automation on that side of the house, it's DevOps that usually should take care of that.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on that as well. So not only are we releasing more applications than ever before, we're doing them in much shorter and more compressed time cycles. And then having been the person on the other side of that equation, working in a bank and having seen the fact that it's very hard to get the professionals, it's hard to get those people, the security people who understand both security and applications. Those people are hard to find, and they're simply not going to be able to scale. We're not going to be able to hire people fast enough to do that. So we're becoming more reliant on as he said, being able to automate that process. And to do that, obviously, the further left we can do that, so much the better. But we can't just rely on humans to do that. A, there aren't enough of them, and B, they take too long to. If we're going to be running a pen test process, that's prohibitive to DevOps methodologies.
Okay. So there's an interesting statistic that's in the ebook, and it has to do with a DigitCert survey that the organization conducted last year. It was 300 IT managers, and 88% of the respondents said that they had a strong interest in integrating security into DevOps. And some of the reasons they gave were keeping security as a separate function, they said, increased risks, and it also lengthened the delivery cycle and pushed up the costs. Is that something, I mean, obviously you guys would agree with those things, but are there other reasons why, we've got to really consider having security integrated into DevOps beyond the obvious?
Absolutely. There was a NIST survey that came out a couple years ago that said to patch something that is in production costs thousands of dollars. To patch something that you catch back when it was still in the code repository costs tens of dollars. So the difference of something like $80 to fix a bug versus $2,500 to fix a bug. So consider one that we all three can sing about, the Apache Struts vulnerability. It's out there. It's on a whole lot of production systems. However, they can't just go through and say, oh, we're going to update the production system, because they don't know what else will break, and nobody wants to break their production. So they absolutely have to go back and fix these developer tools, the platforms, the open code. They've got to fix that and have the up-to-date versions that they're building on and testing. So if they move security left and have it way early in the process, it's cheaper. It's just sheer time cheaper, and then they don't lose the production time at the other end.
And there's another aspect here, because those guys, you know, at the end of the day, if there will be a security breach to the organization, their job is on the stake. You know, we see companies that report that security CISOs and CISOs report to the board about security attacks, security vulnerabilities, number of vulnerabilities in the application. So the personal risk and the organizational risk of being wrong and not fixing something is very high, both to the organization and to the people that take care of the security of the organization. And therefore, you know, they really have to deal with those, you know, with all those cases. And once more, the only way they can do it is by automation with those quantities.
I also think another point that's valid is, you know, is DevOps a challenge to security people? Am I pessimistic or optimistic about this? I think I'm really optimistic. And I think the reason that people are moving security closer into the DevOps space, it gives security professionals a very natural inject point. Right, previously, before we had DevOps and when we had clustered and siloed development, security professionals didn't know how their applications were built. Everybody did things in a very heterogeneous way. Now with CI/CD pipelines, there's an obvious delivery process. It's much easier for security people to come along and understand how their software is being built. They can inject security tooling at one point in a pipeline rather than having to go and manage lots of distributed and very heterogeneous development teams.
Okay, that's actually, that's an interesting, Jeannie, do you have something?
I did have one more point on that.
Sure.
In the old view, security used to own securing all of the endpoints and making sure that the server, the boxes themselves, had standards. Nobody ever owned going back and making sure that all the developer tools were up to the latest version. Again, the open source components were the latest. And I was remembering the SamSam ransomware that came because there was a vulnerability within the JEXBoss, which was a debugging tool. Nobody ever owned checking the developer's tools before. And all they know is, here, security, it's something you couldn't check, that you had no handle on, but now it can actually be a backdoor into your system. So it really is a great opportunity to stop and look up and say, hey, security, development, it's time for you guys to start getting married.
All right. That your point and Colin's point are actually a perfect segue into our next slide, which is, you know, obviously with when you combine security and DevOps, it's not going to be a seamless, easy combination. There are certain hurdles that organizations have to overcome, and one of them is culture. The idea that possibly security, you know, is going to maybe take too long to get, you know, we've all heard the arguments, right? You know, with DevOps you need to get the code out the door, but security is going to slow us down, and you know, it's right now security is really thought more of as a barrier, if you will, to true DevOps. So what are some of the things that you guys when you hear about this particular, especially this misnomer about security slowing down the process, how do you guys address that?
It's Ozzy. So, you know, there's a few elements in here, right? The first thing is that security people, you know, they're trained to think in the terms of risk, right? There's no black and white thing, right? It's all about risk, high risk, low risk, how you, you know, perceive the risk, where's the risk, how to quantify it, right? It's not a black and white thing. Well, when you talk about DevOps, they talk about automation, rules, policies, black and white thing, right? It's either pass or not. It's either the high quality or not quality, right? Can it be moved to production or not? The whole concept of having something gray, which is, risk-based is not an approach that, DevOps guys are trained to think in those dimensions, right? It's totally different ballgame. And when you get into that, this is also the place where you have to understand things like impact on the business side, right? And that's how we define risk. These are all decision points, or if you want, way of thinking that are very far away from DevOps guys that basically automate things by rule versus security things, people that basically try to identify, if you want, exploit or vulnerabilities, realize how risky they are or how big is the exposure internally. These are two colliding approaches, and finding the people that can, on one hand, can understand the risk, have a dialogue with management, demand things and ignore others, and be able to explain all that on one hand, and then go to the other side of the house and automate those things and deal with the gray area. These are two cultures that up till now did not coexist in the same groups, right? And this is the biggest challenge: how to train the DevOps guy to think in a dimension of risk to the business and even understand that kind of a discussion. And on the other hand, understand, take security people and train them to think in policies and that runs automatically and create, solution automatically. And this is not an easy breeze.
And I think at VeryCode, we often speak about the skills gap that developers have, and developers not understanding how to code securely or defensively. I think also one of the problems that security folk have in adopting to DevOps is they often don't understand some of the tooling and technology and the ways that developers are working with DevOps. Right? If we think about DevOps, it's largely a technology shift that's happened. We do operations now using development technologies and methodologies. It's very much a development paradigm. The problem is a lot of security people, and I'm speaking as a former security pro, not really understanding the tools of the trade, how developers are doing their process. For instance, they don't understand the importance of an example would be a CI/CD pipeline. If they're going to inject a security tool that takes many hours or even worse, days to scan, they don't have an awareness, they don't have an appreciation for how that's actually going to disrupt that development process. So it's having that empathy and the understanding. And I think probably of the three sort of tiers there, is probably the security pros that are going to have the biggest cultural or mindset shift that they're going to have to undergo.
I agree entirely, Colin. And sometimes it's just security people speak one language of risk and the other, and programming people speak something different. And it's hard for a security person to say security is an essential non-functional requirement, which developers understand, but security people are like, what do you mean non-functional? Because developers think about epics and capabilities and features and stories and what do they need to do to meet their business needs. Now, they are equally responsible for non-functional requirements that are like reliability, performance, security, maintainability, and scalability. And a lot of times, there's not a lot of attention given to that. And I think I want to go back and say we have a problem way back from at the university level of how we're teaching programmers. We're teaching them on the one side, yeah, this is how you build a feature, but we're not necessarily teaching at that level, this is how you build a secure feature. And then getting them to understand the language is important so that all of the tools that we all build need to be able to bridge that gap and help them understand, oh, you have this risk. What does it mean? Well, it means on line 142 of your code, you didn't sanitize your inputs. So really, I'm 100% with them. We've got to learn to speak each other's language.
Right, and the other side is that, if for a programmer that makes such a mistake, security mistake, or the DevOps guys that didn't catch it later on, the overall risk to the organization could be infinite, right? So, and it's not like in the case that they didn't deliver the code on time or 5 days later, right? If they did a big mistake and included Apache Struth in the code, right, and that's a no-no, and no one discovered that, this could crash the entire organization. So this is not an easy thing to breach. Obviously there are ways to do it, right? And obviously it's not going to stay forever. Companies will find a way to do that. Practices are coming in, but the cost of doing an error here is enormous, and that's very difficult to, for some teams to accept or take the responsibility for, especially on the DevOps side.
So Jeannie, your point of maybe even going back as far as the university level, and the fact that this isn't being taught, do you think, or any of you think that as DevOps does become a more mainstream methodology per se, and the importance of security as part of that process becomes more of a compelling business argument, do you think that maybe more universities will start paying attention and maybe incorporate that into their maybe their computer science curriculums or whatever curriculum their DevOps, the DevOps would fit into?
I think so. I mean, I'm really seeing a lot more of the textbook writers starting to think about some of this. Mm-hmm. And, for instance, like it goes with the question that somebody just asked, what is the role of security in a DevSecOps world? To a certain extent, the security owns the risk. Now, it's shared with developers of saying, how can we help you, rather than being, how can we stop you from releasing bad code? It's, how can we help you release better code earlier? And that's going to be a combination of tools, technology, and frankly, education.
And there are also some low-hanging fruits, right? I come from the open source management side, right? So, these are areas that, you can definitely put a lot of automation. You don't need tools to scan the code and to identify, new vulnerabilities. Those can be reported to you immediately when those are found. So certain areas in the development side can be automated even today. It's easier to train the developers what's risky, what's not, what should be brought in, what shouldn't be brought in. So not everything is so complicated in the development side, and definitely certain areas can be automated already now, and through that people will get trained, gain more experience, etc. And this will come also into the curriculum of the universities that teach, application development for the students.
And I also think it's a case of just awareness. If we think about it now, if you had a chat to your mom, and you spoke to her about application security 10 years ago, my mom wouldn't have had any idea what I'm talking about. Nowadays, people are very familiar. It's in the news every other day. You hear in just casual conversations people talking about cross-site scripting. I've heard people in a pub, for instance, say that. So people are becoming aware of that. It's no longer, and I've been on the VeryCode side talking to developers for about 8 years now. And there's the conversation has changed from why do I need to be worried about cross-site scripting or SQL injection or whatever the issue is, to what do I do about it, right? So there is that mindset that the thought process is changing. People now get it, and we're shifting the problem to how do we deal with it rather than acknowledging that we have to deal with it.
And obviously, you didn't speak with my mom, right?
All right, great. Well, we've got still a whole lot to go over. So let's go ahead and move on to this second hurdle, which is tools. Obviously they can help, but they can also be a hindrance because, if you don't have agreement on a common set of tools across development, operations, and security groups, you're always going to have somebody who just doesn't want to play that game. So, Jeannie, can you kind of maybe talk about some of the, that need to find tools that, find the issues early find issues with the code early in the process, and then what organizations can do to find the right tool set and methodology across, that spectrum of the development and operations and security folks?
Oh, absolutely. I think arguments about what tools a different team is going to use have probably broken up more teams than anything. Choosing whether your repository is going to be Git or Perforce, for instance, I'm sure has been more arguments of anything. What are the different tools? And the neat thing for us is we can add security to any of them, but tool standardizations across a lot of enterprises, across a lot of large organizations, is exactly the same battles that we fought nearly 20 years ago. For instance, if I was buying, another company, I have their data standards, I have their data, whatever they have for security on their side, but I want to get them to my security policy. And it's the same way because a lot of companies are growing through acquisition. I mean, you guys are having this over at VeryCode now. You have a company that was bought by a company who was bought by a company who was bought by a company. Where do they have standards? Well, you have this bunch of guys that use IntelliJ. You have that other bunch of guys, they use Eclipse. You have a third bunch of guys that code on their laptops and just use Jenkins to, get it all moving out. You have 4 different ticketing systems. All of this becomes a big adventure for any large organization to say, how do we create tool standardizations, gently ease everybody into it, and not lose a quarter of our developers who just absolutely refuse to learn a brand new tool. And I mean, I really do feel for them. But if you look at end to end in terms of the DevOps, there's a lot of pieces. There's the repository side. Can we all scan for vulnerabilities when it's still just in a repository? Absolutely we can. Can we add security into the build tools, our source code management systems like the Eclipse IntelliJ? Absolutely we can. How about automated deployment? You have it in Git, and maybe Colin, Ozzy has it on Git, and Colin is just using Jenkins. Maybe we all put it into a Sonar Cube, and that's our common tool. Can we scan there? Yes, we can. Can we at least integrate, with the ticketing? Can we say, okay, maybe only the security team is looking at production side. Can we put those tickets straight back into development? Absolutely, we can. So here, and then it's the worst scenario, not the worst scenario, the best scenario. A lot of people are starting to say, we want to move all of our DevOps into the cloud and get it off Jeannie's laptop. Well, Microsoft just bought GitHub so that people can move their development into the cloud. So if there's a common place that they do a lot of these things, can we scan and do our security checks there? Yes, we can. That's what we on the industry side have been trying to say. We have all of these areas covered. We don't necessarily care which side you scan from, but it can be a little complex of setting the tools up to say, maybe with you have standardization, it'll be easier, but then you on the other side have, well, what if they have a microservices environment, which is literally every 3 guys make up a microservice that makes up a larger application. Each one of those options has its own security challenges. Microservices create more security vulnerabilities, but they also patch them faster. So there's such a big mess in terms of tools, and we really understand that standardizing anything is always going to be the biggest tool and hurdle.
All right, great. Colin.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that I see when I talk to customers about security tooling is I think developers do fixate on wanting to spend a lot of time evaluating, testing, setting up acceptance criteria. And really what they probably need to be doing more is just get something into their pipeline, just get scanning, get finding things. The tool doesn't have to necessarily be exactly the tool they would want or that they would have written themselves. As long as they're doing something, as long as they are surfacing technical debt, as long as they've got a plan to know what to do with that debt in a manner that sits with their workflow. And that they can start addressing issues. I think the biggest danger that we face is the do nothing problem, right? Is people using the fact that the tools take too long, or the tools are too noisy, or the tools are too expensive, or whatever reason that a development team or an organization might have to not to do something about the problem. They'd be far better off picking something. I mean, from one end of the spectrum, there's fantastic open source and free tools that people can be using. There's no real excuse not to be doing something about this. And to Jeannie's point, that's a very good one. I mean, this is a software-driven world now. All these technology stacks, all these tools that we've got are all API enabled. Right, there's common interchange formats. If the interchange formats don't exist, there's an XML or a JSON output. There's no reason that you can't plug a particular tool into some other system that you're using. So I think these are all really excuses. where there's a will, there's a way, and I think people just need to get on with it and get testing.
Okay. Ozzy,
So
any
I'll
thoughts?
agree with I'll agree with Colin and Jenny that there are enough tools out there. I want to make just two more comments. One, and Colin just touched it. I believe that we did a survey at White Source, and also if you review some Gartner reports, etc., you'll find out that in today's most environments, something like 60, 70, 80% of the code is open source, built upon open source, right? And companies have to recognize that managing the open source security, is different than managing the proprietary code, because open source requires ongoing maintenance, if you want, right? Mm-hmm. Because a piece of code that you picked yesterday, could be fine, but 5 weeks later, a new vulnerability may be found in that piece. You have to fix it, or be aware that when there is a fix, and then go on because additional vulnerabilities may be found. So the open source component in the proprietary code requires ongoing review and maintenance and alerts, etc. While the proprietary code usually can be scanned once, maybe twice, fixed and move on. So companies have to understand, that they have those two separate sets of code that need slightly different treatment, if you want, and then they can pick and choose a variety of tools that can help them. I think that all companies will realize that tools that will help them to identify issues, problems, etc., on the left side, on the shift left side, will enable them to reduce the cost later. So I would definitely start with tools in this area, and then start to look for more things that can assist at the repository level, at the build server level, etc.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. So we're looking at about 37 minutes past the hour. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next part, which is some best practices that were listed in the ebook to help organizations as they attempt to integrate security into DevOps. And the first one is plan accordingly. And basically, that means have a clear, workable definition of what exactly you mean by DevSecOps. I think this is really important because one of the things that all of you have brought up is the fact that security and DevOps practitioners don't necessarily speak the same language. So so obviously have that definition, and then clearly define what the goals are in implementing the model. So what do you guys have any kind of thoughts on the best ways to go about doing that, or maybe some things that have worked for you well in the past?
It's Ozzy. I'll start. So I think that it's, especially since it's some kind of a new practice, we meet a lot of clients. They don't know what they don't know, right? They know that there is an issue. They know that they, in our case, use open source as part of the code, that it's growing, right? But they don't know how big is the problem and what's the best approach to automate the process. So, but I don't want to look at the open source only, right? In our recommendation, usually, and we work with other partners that provide the other parts of the application security, is do some kind of what I would call gap analysis. Take one or two applications that represent, the business, moderate risk, etc. Run some tests on top of that. See how many open source components are there, how risky they are. See how many vulnerabilities exist in your own IP, right? Understand how severe they are. See what's the cost of fixing those. Do such kind of review and build yourself, for the first time, the business case for moving forward. Once you realize that, you can take it into numerous directions, because, as discussed earlier, there are million tools, not millions, but a lot of tools out there. Those that can block stuff at the gate, those that can detect later, those that can maintain later. It really depends on what you find in that gap analysis, and those findings can help you to decide how big is the issue, how fast you have to move, what kind of a team do you need, what kind of training do you have to give to developers, to DevOps guys, and maybe security guys, what kind of funding you need, right? So our recommendation to all those clients, start with gap analysis. Most of the vendors that I'm familiar with will allow you to do such a test and review your own environment or system, see where you are, and from there go wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a lot of organizations don't know how they pair up against their peers. And I think doing some kind of discovery work initially up front when you're starting a program, I think that's often really valuable. And I think what you probably want to do is pick a couple of ends of that spectrum. VeryCode, for instance, when you initially engage, they offer a limited scope evaluation, and I normally encourage people to try and pick some good and some bad, so that you get an idea of what that spectrum looks like. The thing that people normally fail to plan into their program is what to do about the risk that they discover, because you're probably going to discover more than you anticipated you would. Right now, tools being tools, no tool is perfect, and tools are often going to unsurface issues that perhaps due to your particular environments aren't valid issues. They're something that don't represent material risk. So unless you as the organization have a plan on how to deal with that, you're going to get yourself into trouble. You're going to deploy a tool that is going to start throwing up warnings, putting red onto dashboards, and people are going to panic. And what will happen often at that point is that people will say, just turn it off, I don't want to know anymore. And you've actually painted yourself into a far worse situation than if you'd been doing nothing, because now you're aware that you've got risk. Somebody is owning that risk in the organization, and you haven't got a plan to how to deal with it. So it's important that you plan to have a security process and to be doing security testing. That's fantastic, but think ahead. Think about what you're going to do when you unsurface that, because you're going to.
Okay.
I agree, and I just wanted to add a little piece onto what both of these gentlemen have said. We talk a lot about business to the risk because that's the security way of looking at it, business risk. I could be hacked in the other. With a lot of the legislation that's come up recently, we really need to talk about data privacy risk as well, and how do we build better privacy by design way back in the beginning when we're deciding what the risks are going to be. What is the objective? How do we measure it? How do we test it? If we can't test for it, should we ship it? And that goes a little bit back to privacy and security being that non-functional but essential requirement, and building it in from the very beginning so that the director of engineering can look at the director of IT security and they shake hands and decide, we care about both business risk, what's going to be in the papers, and the data privacy risk, or what are we going to have to pay a lot of money to Europe because we didn't look at.
Okay, great. All right, best practice number 2, automate what you can. And Ozzy, I know you've talked about this already, but obviously manual security tests and processes can slow down the cadence and velocity of software delivery. So obviously embedding automated controls for application security early, and then throughout the integration, delivery, and deployment processes can help speed things along swimmingly. So Ozzy, I'm sure you've got a few words you want to say about that.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is extremely important. Obviously, as I said, at White Source, we deal with the open source side, so I cannot relate to the other parts of the code, right? The good, as I said, but still, we know that this is the majority of the code today. There's one thing that I want to add, which will not be redundant. Companies today know that they are not going to fix everything, right? They're going to live with some of the vulnerabilities or exploit, whatever that they found in the code, right? So being able to identify what's relevant and what's not relevant, what are the vulnerabilities that are important, what are not, what should be fixed is very important. So, and as I believe that what Jenny said earlier, or Cohen, don't remember, this will allow you to avoid some of the alerts that you'll start getting very quickly. So putting some kind of a way or tool to understand what's relevant out of all the stuff that you'll see or find in your code is extremely important. And the second thing is start with the lowest hanging fruits, right? It will take 2-3 years for organizations to get from where they are today to the next step, right? Where DevSecOps guys know how to react, know what to do on time, etc. So starting with the low hanging fruit that will provide, high security in an obvious process that does not involve too many people, where the rules are simple, is extremely important. There are some areas. I can tell you, well, this is our business, of course, but open source is definitely one of those. Gartner actually now recommend that companies will start with the open source security before they go to their proprietary code. But find your areas where these are low-hanging fruits. You can achieve a lot in a quick time. Select the tools, do this kind of a gap analysis that will enable you to understand where you are at the risk level, how urgent such a project is, how you can automate, how that fits your developers and DevOps guys, and continue from there.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think as far as the automation goes, a lot of DevOps teams, a lot of people running pipelines are worried about putting security tooling into their pipeline because they think it's going to slow it down. A real good best practice there is just put the tools in, run them in passive mode, right? Don't print the reports, don't send the reports out, don't block releases. Just get that technology, get the security testing, get everybody familiar with how it works, get it baked into the automation, get it into the CI/CD pipelines. When the time is ready, when you've got your plan together about what you're going to do with the risk that you're unsurfacing, then you can start running it in a more active mode. But yeah, automate up front, automate as early as possible. That way, everybody becomes familiar with what your security tooling is going to be doing in their pipeline.
Okay, great. I want to go ahead and move on to the next two since we're starting to run out of time here. Let's see, the next one is know your tools, which basically means, do your homework on before settling on specific tools. And then the next one is something, Colin, you've already touched on, which is avoiding alert fatigue. And that is also, I guess, part of knowing your tools. And you're absolutely right in saying that, having systems that are continually sending out alerts and generating too many false alerts can just drive somebody absolutely up a wall and make them, basically say enough. So, what are some of the best practices there when we're talking about determining which tools to get? And Jeannie, I know you've already touched on this a little bit, but specifically when it comes to making sure that the tools are working the best for everyone involved. What are some of the top 3 things that you kind of look for? Maybe Jeannie, you can take this, and then Colin, if you want to address the alert fatigue again, that's certainly fine.
Sure, this is something that the security team knows all about, because they get way too much coming in from a firewall because everybody in the world's trying to ping it and map the internet. Mm-hmm. You can't respond to 1,000 things. And that's the same for programmers. If you ran, there are good open source tools out there for doing application security testing. We all acknowledge that. But if you hand somebody a list of findings and the first 5 that they look into, and it took 20 minutes for each of them to say, that's not really real in this environment, or that's not applicable to this environment, then they've just spent basically over an hour, they throw it up and they say, this is not an effective tool, and they walk away. So absolutely, false positives are a really big deal. We've had a few customers come in and chat with us saying, what is the big deal that they thought about? And they're like, yeah, the biggest one is, how accurate is it? And then what are the policies that decide whether something goes to production, or even better, as both of these gentlemen have said, automation. Can we make it so that if there are critical and high findings that the build just fails? And automation is always the best, I think.
All right.
Yeah, and to the question of what do you do with very noisy test results is I think if you're going to have a reasonable size code base, you're going to get a lot of findings regardless of what tool you use. And I think to have a security team or whoever's responsible for that triage, I'm reading ahead to one of the questions. I think this might answer this. Is you've got to be thinking about what's your security team going to do with the results that they get from a tool. You can't simply take the results in an unfiltered way and hand them to your development teams. The responsibility of that security team is going to be able to put some context around this. An example would be if you're getting results from a scan where there's issues with SQL injection, but for whatever reason you know that application doesn't have an SQL database enabled, right? It's just seeing some code that's in the code base, but practically there's no database connected. You know that you can remove those from the report. So that's really where the security team are going to provide the value add, right? And then they can help denoise those results so that by the time they get to the development teams, they're actionable findings. Right, so it is the security team should know the tools, and they should have some kind of context or awareness of the applications in their environment.
All right, great. Now the last tip that the ebook has is the age-old idea of using an incremental approach. Just don't go all in at once, because until you've got a comfort level company-wide, you're never really going to get full acceptance. So, starting small to demonstrate that value of having security within the DevOps processes can go a long way toward having long-term acceptance, and to the point where folks might question why we never really did this before. So with that, I want to go ahead and give a shout out again to my panelists here, and I want to give them a couple minutes to let them talk a little bit about their company, and then we'll jump into audience questions as soon as we can. So first of all is WhiteSource. So Ozzy, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about your company?
Okay, thank you very much. So firstly, who we are, we provide what's called software composition analysis solution, that's WhiteSource, focused only on the open source security and compliance side. We have more than 500 clients around the world. 1.2 million developers are using our solution. We have 25% of Fortune 1000 accounts are using us. And we grow very fast, 300% year over year. As I said earlier, we focus specifically on the open source side of the code. Our solution provide both the inventory, identify the inventory of the open source, the security vulnerabilities that comes with that, and the legal side of the open source components. What makes us unique is that we are part of, we put ourselves as part of the development cycle. So, users, clients that use us, can start with what we call shift left or Web Advisor, a tool that helps the developers to identify the open source, the risk in open source that they plan to use when they just look at it for the first time at the repository, identify whether it will fit the company policy, etc. Is it too risky if there's someone else doing that? Once they pick it up, it will kick all the policies, organizational policies, even before it's being pushed to the build server, making sure that only the right stuff is getting inside. And once the inventory is set, it keeps on tracking on the inventory and identify, provide alerts when new vulnerabilities are found for the any components in the inventory, and of course if there are any fixes. A later feature that we just released is what we call effective usage analysis, which basically, we talked about noise, is able to reduce the level of vulnerabilities from what clients have to the relevant one by 70%. Basically, it's a way to look at the open source component that companies are using, and out of those identify by scanning only those that are really affecting the company because the way the developers are using those open source components. That enables the companies to reduce by 70% or even more the total number of vulnerabilities that they should deal with. We're based in Israel. That's where our headquarters are, with large offices in New York, and we're happy to take any call from anyone. Usually, Clients that come with us start with some kind of a gap analysis or test their own environment. From there, to continue.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ozzy. Colin, why don't you tell us a little about VeryCode?
Certainly, thank you. So VeryCode are probably the leading solution provider for static code analysis. Right? VeryCode offer a continuous platform that offers static code analysis. So that's your white box testing. It's a cloud-based solution, so customers can subscribe to a cloud service. And that means the cloud service gives them the advantage of being able to almost infinitely scale the scope of the application program. We've got customers who are scanning thousands of apps, and they're literally running hundreds of scans per day. So that's static code analysis. We also offer dynamic scanning and also, as you said, software composition analysis. We've recently acquired SourceClear, who's one of the leading providers of next generation static code analysis. And we have over 2,000 customers. And I think at last count, we'd scanned over 2 trillion lines of code. So that's the scale that we've enabled our customers to achieve with our cloud service.
Wonderful. All right, great. Thank you, Colin. Jeannie, why don't you talk about Whitehat Security? Jeannie, are you with me?
I am, and I even hit the non-mute button. Whitehat opened in 2001. Jeremiah Grossman, who came up with dynamic scanning, basically from a very public Yahoo discovery that he'd found, and he was our founder worked there for a while and then said, really, this is the service of finding things in the wild and how do they work. So we do dynamic scanning, which also includes business logic assessments. So it's more sometimes than just scanning code, but it's saying, how can a human being abuse and do things with how it's authenticated, how are error and exception handlings. So we kind of do that pen test annually with our dynamic scanning. We also then shortly after that moved into source code scanning. We handle mobile scanning, so mobile binaries or mobile source code and mobile penetration tests. And software composition analysis is kind of built into our SaaS tool. Shortly be moving out and operating that separately as well. So everywhere through the stack, there's an opportunity to add security. And all of the places are important because sometimes, as we say, contact with the enemy is what is most important. So end to end, it's all important to look at. IoT, are your APIs secure?
Okay, all right, great. Thank you, all three of you. Okay, moving on. We are about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so I'm just going to dive right into audience questions now. First question, is it advisable to leverage 2 different toolkits, or is it to fully standardize on a single tool suite? So for whoever wants to answer that.
I think it depends. Ozzy, you go.
Sorry. There are companies that will go with best of breed. There are companies that will look for one throat to choke. I don't want to give any advice. It's more important to be able to achieve things very quickly. I don't think that what people will select in the first cycle, they'll continue using for the long run. So it's really, per company.
Okay. Colin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
That's exactly what I would have said.
All right. Great minds think alike then. That's great. Okay. All right. One more question, then we're going to have to close it out, I think. What is the role of the security team in a DevSecOps world?
Developers, I think, if you don't mind me taking this one, developers are very much in the sprint to sprint, epic to epic. So in a lot of ways, they can be a little bit myopic in some ways. Having the oversight view of a vulnerability management and the business intelligence, and there's a whole lot of toolkits that all of our services from my colleagues and I all plug into that say, what is the big picture? Security in the end owns the big picture. For instance, let's use Equifax as an example. When they got hacked through an open source Apache Struts vulnerability and possibly a couple other pieces as well, nobody thought, I'm going to fire the the engineering manager for using old tools or for not having up-to-date development pieces. It was their CISO that got kicked. And in the end, security is always going to be the final throat that is choked. So security has a very vested interest in helping development learn the tools. And maybe it's security at first also needs to start using developing language and explaining things in developer terms in exactly the same way that the developer needs to come out and tell the security people, I need help. I need to know in my language where this is found. So I need to know how to improve and what can I do and what is the risk in security terms while I teach you that I need to parameterize my queries or I need to sanitize my inputs, and how do they learn to speak each other's language? So I don't think anything's going away one way or the other, because in the end, security will always be the one that gets fired when a website gets hacked.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I'm sorry to have to do this, but we need to close it out now because we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank the audience for submitting questions. If we didn't get to your question, just know that the panelists will be receiving a copy of all the questions, and I'm sure somebody from their organization will be happy to follow up with you offline. Also, want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, you will be able to access it on demand. The email we will be sending out after this event will include both a link to today's webinar as well as a link to the ebook that we mentioned throughout the webinar that you'll be able to download. Let's see, the webinar is also going to be on the Security Boulevard website, so you can always go there and check it out. But Colin and Jeannie and Ozzy, thank you all so much for taking the time today. It's a great presentation. I got a lot out of it. I had a great time. Hope you did too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.